Well, it's been an absolute delight to read Barbra Streisand's book, Barbara. I'm always really careful when I say Barbra Streisand because she actually did an interview where she taught people how to say her name, and she said it's sand on the end. And she even corrected, didn't she, Siri for the Apple products. She actually made sure that her name was pronounced correctly. So I was very careful. Now, this book is a complete delight, but the little book bit, the juicy little bit, the bit that you'll be most interested in is the bit about King Charles, then Prince Charles, and Barbara's relationship and their great friendship over the years, which has endured up to this day. Now, I know you all know the story about him drinking tea with her and everything, but I'm just going to go over that very briefly, but then I'm going to tell you a really good story, a quite juicy story, and it's one that I sort of read in between the lines a little bit. Now, I'm not implying they had an affair. I believe her. Nothing happened. I totally believe that. But I do have a suspicion that the then Prince Charles may have actually tried. Okay, so in the 70s, about when the then Prince Charles looked a little bit like, where is it? Where's my book? Oh, here it is, up behind me here. And, excuse me, reaching, but he looked pretty much like this when they met in this book, because there's a lot of photographs. There's ones from the 80s in this, but there's also earlier from the 70s. So Charles was looking quite hunky, quite good, and his ship actually docked in San Diego. Now, seeing he was in the good old USA, he was asked if there was anyone that he would be interested in meeting. Now, it was expected that he would say something like, you know, Raquel Welch or someone, because in the 70s she was huge, you know, so they thought that he would say something like that. But what they didn't realise was that Barbra Streisand was actually up on his wall when he was at Cambridge. Total crush on her, loved her. And he said that he wanted to meet the woman behind that beautiful voice. So it was arranged, and he turned up on a soundstage where Barbara was actually recording a soundtrack for a movie, and the orchestra was sort of put on hold while then Prince Charles entered the soundstage. A lot of excitement. There was about 50 photographers, Barbara says. So she went up to talk to him and greet him, and she admits that she wasn't as gracious as she could have been because she was under time pressure. She was aware that the orchestra was put on hold, but she knew that he was a very important guest and worth the time, but her mind was in two places. So she was standing there and she was sipping tea, because when she went back she would have to sing, so she's keeping her voice moist and whatever. And so they had a conversation, and she said that she picked up that he was actually as shy as she was, and she just, without thinking, offered him a sip of her tea. And as you know, he took a sip out of her cup. And that caused all the photographers there, all the flashes went off. And it was big news. It made front page news at the time. Now, they didn't meet up again for a lot of years, at least 20 years. And Barbara had gone on to do a lot of hit movies, as you know, but she hadn't really performed that much live. And it was in the early 90s where she was sort of getting back into her stride, and she decided to add a charity component to her London part of her tour. And that spurred the then Prince Charles to attend. And, you know, it sort of smacked of a bit of excitement because, like I said, they hadn't seen each other for nearly 20 years. And I'll just read you this little snippet from the book about that night. On the second night, Prince Charles came to the concert, and a portion of the ticket sales benefited his charity, the Prince's Trust. He arranged to come backstage before the show, and then she says a really interesting thing about royal protocol. She said he couldn't come back after the show and probably spend as much time as he would like with her, because no one else could leave the arena until he left. So royal protocol sort of dictated that if he didn't want to hold everybody up, it was better to see the artist prior to the show. Now, I have to tell you about the flowers the day after this concert because it's a really cute little story. Now, she received heaps of flowers, as you would imagine, the next day, and they were all very formal, sort of florist arrangements. But she noticed a really lovely bunch of flowers that looked almost gathered by hand, from someone's flower garden. And she said, "Oh, who sent those?" Because they stood out because they were so beautiful. And her assistant said, "Oh, Charles somebody." And she checked the little card, and of course it had the royal crest on it. And he'd actually picked the flowers, probably his gardener picked the flowers, from his garden at Highgrove. Now, about a year later, he invited her to stay at Highgrove, and he sent a car to pick her up. And this is in 95. Now, be aware that in 92, Diana and he actually split up. And Barbra Streisand only has lovely things to say about Diana. She did actually meet her earlier than this actual visit. So they were separated. They were formally separated. And the divorce actually officially came through in 96. So really, Prince Charles was single and Diana was single, and they were firmly separated in separate households. Okay. Now, Barbra Streisand herself was also single. She hadn't met James Brolin yet. So, anything could have happened. And I believe them that nothing did happen. But there's a little story where she's staying at Highgrove that I just have a suspicion that, Prince Charles is a normal red-blooded male. His crush was staying in his home. And I think he might have tried just a move. You tell me what you think. I'll tell you about this dinner. She rocks up, and she really loved the foyer of Highgrove. And she says that later on she even designed or decorated one of her homes, the foyer to one of her homes, in a similar style because she found it so cozy and warm and classic, and she just couldn't rave enough. So she goes up to this beautiful bedroom they've given her with a big 4-poster bed, and she gets dressed for dinner. Now, she put on very high heels and a long, beautiful white dress, and she goes down the stairs, whereupon the then Prince Charles takes all his guests out for a tour of the Highgrove garden. Now, Barbra Streisand said that this was actually quite difficult because the high heels meant that, going down garden paths and things, she tended to sink when she wasn't on stone. She was tending to sink a little bit, and I guess she was a tad anxious in a long white dress. It's not the sort of outfit you particularly want to go on a garden tour in. But anyway, she got through that okay. And then she was led to where they were going to have this dinner. And to her surprise, she was on the right-hand side of the then Prince of Wales. Now, that is a very big compliment. There were other people attending this dinner, but if you're placed at the right-hand side of a royal family member, that means that you are valued, they want to talk to you, they want to get to know you better. That is a prime position to be in if you're ever invited to a dinner by royalty. So just remember that little tip. So she was thrilled, and she said they had a lovely dinner and it was great. And then she says that she retired to her boudoir alone, and I believe her. But an interesting incident happened the very next morning. So the next morning, there's a tap, tap, tap on the door, and a breakfast tray was brought in by a member of staff, and it was a traditional English breakfast. And so Barbara sits up in her bed. Now, in between getting the tray and the next thing that happened, her assistant actually also knocked on the door and entered the room and was chatting to Barbara. And then she left open the door a little crack, and then Prince Charles' little Jack Russell Terrier actually popped its head, and Barbara greeted him, and he ran in and he jumped up on the bed, and he ended up snuggling under the covers and snuggling up to her, and she confesses that she was actually feeding egg to this gorgeous little doggy. And then they get another tap tap on the door. It was busy in Barbara's bedroom that morning. And it was Prince Charles, the then Prince Charles. Now, the assistant was in the bedroom, but he popped his head round the door and said, "Oh, I'm just wondering if you've seen my dog Tiggy." Now, that blew my mind that his little Jack Russell Terrier was called Tiggy, because I guess that would have, just inflamed Diana's jealousy even anymore, but that's another story. So Barbara says yes, admits that the dog is in her bed, snuggling up to her, and that she'd even fed him a little bit of egg. And then Prince Charles was quite surprised because he said, "I'm astounded," because his little dog never left his side and certainly didn't venture off and snuggle up to, strangers. So he was really amazed. And it was at that point where I'm reading between the lines, and I'll ask you what you think. But I think the tap, tap, tap on the bedroom door looking for his dog was an opportunity. I just wonder what would have happened if Barbara's assistant hadn't have been in the room. And I don't know, I think he might have tried a little kiss or a bit of romance. You never know. Who wouldn't? But it didn't eventuate because, like I said, the assistant was in the room, which is so disappointing because as Barbara Streisand made a joke herself in the concert that the then Prince Charles attended, she said, I wish I had been a little bit nicer to him back in the 70s. I might have been the first real Jewish princess. And she might have been too. Let me know what you think. It's such a fun book. I can recommend it. If you're a Barbara Streisand fan, definitely get it. It is just packed full of so much fantastic stories, particularly behind the scenes stories of all her great movies and all the great things that she's achieved and done. And, as a singer that just adores her, I love this book. So that might be another one for your Christmas list. It's getting bigger, isn't it? And I'll see you again very soon. Bye-bye.